Too big to fail? The US government didn't think so. 10 years ago, it allowed one of America's biggest investment banks to collapse. And it triggered a crisis, not just in the United States, but across the world. The Lehman Brothers bankruptcy eventually led to a global recession, which is still being felt today. Millions of homes and jobs were lost. And analysts say the rise of populist politics has its roots in the financial crisis of 2008. But how did Lehman collapse? And why did it cause a worldwide recession? It all began with something called the subprime mortgage. A decade ago, cheap credit was widely available. And US banks were handing out home loans to people who couldn't repay them. These mortgages were bundled up and sold to banks like Lehman. So when millions of homeowners began to default on their mortgages, investors suffered huge losses. Banks stopped lending to each other, and eventually, all that credit disappeared. And a modern economy simply can't function without access to credit. The collapse in the subprime market affected banks across the world. What followed was a decade of austerity, as governments around the globe raised taxes and cut spending. Despite the reckless behavior of the bankers, none of them were held to account. Instead, governments helped to bail out the banks using taxpayer money. So 10 years later, is there a risk of another financial crisis? Restrictions have been put on banks, but critics argue they didn't go far enough. Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister of Britain in 2008, says another crisis is inevitable.
And I feel we're sleepwalking into the next crisis. I feel that this is a leaderless world. And I think when the next crisis comes, and there will be a future crisis, we'll find that we neither have the fiscal and monetary room for manoeuvre that we had in 2008-9, or the willingness to take that action.
Brown says most of the issues that caused the collapse 10 years ago remain unresolved. He says the bankers that caused the crisis should have been punished as a deterrence. According to the Institute of International Finance, global debt has reached a record $237 trillion. That's 70 trillion more than it was a decade earlier. And regulations on the banking sector have been relaxed. In May, US President Donald Trump reversed parts of the Dodd-Frank Banking Reform Act. He said it would help banks grow, but critics argue it will encourage the reckless behavior of 2008. Trump has also been criticized for starting trade wars and isolating the United States from the rest of the world. Analysts warn that if there is another crash, it will be much harder to resolve due to a lack of cooperation between nations. So is the world ignoring signs of a new financial crisis, and what can be done to prevent it? Hyder Abbasi, The Newsmakers.